The hunt was already in motion when the boat settled deeper into the water than doctrine advised. Steel groaned under a pressure that was never meant to be comfortable, only survivable. The soundscape inside the hull narrowed to a handful of cues: circulating pumps, restrained breathing, metal responding to stress with muted complaint. Above, the surface was no longer a place of navigation, but a moving ceiling of threat. The sea had been compartmentalized by hostile patterns, each one learned, refined, and now repeated with mechanical patience. There was no confusion in the opposing force, only procedure. The first detonation arrived not as sound, but as displacement. Water compressed, then released itself against the hull, shaking fixtures that crews trusted more from habit than from proven reliability. Dust drifted from insulation. Hands moved automatically to secure what could still be secured. No voice called out orders. The sequence had already been internalized. When depth charges followed, their spacing revealed intent rather than chance. The pattern spoke of training, not improvisation. It suggested that the destroyers above were not searching in hope, but confirming what they already believed. Each blast adjusted the internal environment by degrees too subtle to measure by instruments alone. Temperature shifted, air thickened. The light seemed weaker, though every bulb remained intact. Perception narrowed as pressure pressed inward from all sides, turning the compartment into a closed system with finite tolerance. The hunt above was not merely an attempt to destroy metal and men. It was an engineered effort to exhaust margins, to force compliance through cumulative strain. The escape maneuver that followed did not announce itself. There was no dramatic descent, no reckless plunge. Instead, there was a controlled willingness to accept a depth that others considered impractical. Ballast adjustments were measured. Planes were angled with restraint. The boat did not rush downward. It sank as though agreeing with the sea rather than challenging it. This was not evasion as motion, but evasion as posture. The destroyers above interpreted the change through familiar assumptions. A vessel under pursuit descended because it was afraid, because it sought concealment, because it had room below and no safety above. This logic had supported hundreds of encounters. Charges were adjusted, patterns extended. The sea between surface and deeper layers became saturated with threat. Explosions overlapped. Shock waves interacted. Any object remaining within expected parameters would have been crushed or driven upward into further exposure. Inside the hull, fear did not manifest as panic. It manifested as discipline. Men monitored valves they could not see moving. They listened for sounds that could not be clearly identified. They tracked the interval between detonations not to count them, but to feel the rhythm forming. Each new explosion confirmed the same assumption from above. The pursuers were responding to expectation, not observation. What had been mocked before this engagement was not the depth itself, but the reasoning behind accepting such a posture. Prevailing doctrine favored maneuver over endurance. Survival was associated with speed, with clever changes in bearing, with exploiting blind arcs. Choosing to remain nearly motionless under pressure had been described as passive. Risky, unnecessary. It was dismissed as accounting for fear rather than exploiting opportunity. Yet the deeper the boat went, the less precise the patterns above became. Charges detonated where targets were presumed to be, not where they actually were. The water column absorbed more energy before it reached hull and frame. Sound traveled differently, bending and diffusing in ways that degraded the clarity of echoes. The very environment that threatened implosion also diminished detection. The destroyers responded by tightening their patterns and widening them at the same time, a contradiction resolved only by repetition. They swept areas already covered. They corrected for imagined escape vectors. Their sonar returns lost distinction, but their procedural confidence remained intact. Each pass reinforced belief rather than questioning it. Minutes stretched beyond their usual meaning. Without external reference, time became an internal construct marked by breath cycles and pressure gauge drift. Sweat formed slowly, evaporated poorly, and returned the impression of heat to enclosed skin. The crew understood that nothing was happening because everything was happening exactly as anticipated. The maneuver required patience beyond courage. It demanded trust and calculations that offered no immediate feedback. Above, coordination intensified. Multiple hulls shared contact information that grew increasingly abstract. Reports referenced probability, likelihood, residual noise. The language of certainty gave way to qualifiers, but the hunt continued. To disengage while belief persisted would have implied error, and error had no place in the system that governed their actions. Depth charges began to fall farther from the true position, not because the target had moved, but because assumptions had shifted. The unseen boat was now treated as damaged, drifting, or attempting a desperate ascent. Charges detonated above the actual depth, their shock dissipating before reaching the hull. The sea became a distorted shield rather than a direct threat. Inside the boat, instruments reflected the strain honestly, but without drama. Stress lines approached intolerable thresholds and held. Metal deformed within margins that designers had specified, but commanders rarely tested. There was no romance in this endurance. Only the persistence of material meeting expectation exactly where theory suggested it should. Engineering replaced heroism with tolerance. The destroyers adjusted once more, then again. Fuel was consumed. Coordination required constant correction. Fatigue entered decision loops unnoticed. The absence of confirmation was interpreted as concealment rather than absence. The idea that the boat was no longer within effective reach remained unconsidered, not because it was impossible, but because it contradicted training reinforced by prior success. When the final charges were expended, there was no announcement of failure, only a gradual slowing of search patterns and a widening of coverage that diluted focus. The sea returned to a relative quiet that carried no reassurance, only uncertainty. Above, the hunt had not ended with defeat, but with unresolved conclusion. That distinction mattered to doctrines, but did not change reality below. The boat remained still long after the last detonation faded into distant water movement. Movement was delayed not out of fear, but calculation. Any premature ascent risked re-entry into detection envelopes that were assumed to be intact. The decision to wait relied on the same principle as the decision to descend: adherence to system behavior over individual impulse. When ascent finally began, it was incremental and unremarkable. No alarms signaled victory. No internal conditions improved dramatically. The success of the maneuver was defined entirely by the absence of consequence. Above, for destroyers had moved on, convinced not of failure, but of resolution elsewhere. In later analysis, this encounter was not celebrated for daring. It was noted for its deviation from accepted responses and its validation of environmental exploitation over active denial. The escape was not achieved by speed, deception, or aggression, but by aligning structural limits with enemy expectation and allowing the opposing system to exhaust itself against its own assumptions. That this approach had been mocked beforehand mattered only insofar as it revealed the inertia of doctrine. Innovation in this case did not appear as invention, but as willingness to remain within discomfort longer than the adversary could rationalize. The boat had not outmaneuvered its hunters. It had outlasted the logic that governed their pursuit. The sea absorbed the incident without record. Water closed behind steel as it always had. The destroyers carried their reports forward, altered slightly, but not enough to provoke immediate change. Yet within classified assessments and quiet evaluations, the encounter lingered as an example of how systems collapse not under direct assault, but under sustained mismatch between expectation and reality. The implications of that mismatch did not surface immediately, because systems learn slowly and only when repetition forces acknowledgement. In the months that followed, similar encounters accumulated without pattern recognition at the command level. Each one was treated as anomalous, attributed to local conditions or incomplete data rather than structural weakness. Reports described targets that vanished without observable escape vectors, leaving behind disturbed water and degraded acoustic returns that could not be reconciled with existing tactical models. The sea, once again, functioned as an amplifier of assumption rather than evidence. Within submarine crews, the lesson was transmitted indirectly. It was never formalized in manuals or elevated as doctrine. Instead, it emerged through subtle modifications in behavior. Longer acceptance of silence, delayed reactions to perceived threat cues, trust in material limits that engineers had designed but operational culture had discouraged exploiting. These adjustments were rarely discussed in abstract terms. They manifested as patience exercised under pressure and a refusal to respond theatrically to aggression. Destroyer formations, by contrast, continued to prioritize activity as proof of control. Movement signaled engagement. Depth charges signaled resolve. The absence of a kill confirmed persistence rather than failure. This internal logic reinforced itself, binding crews more tightly to procedures that appeared effective because deviation was rarely rewarded. Each hunting pattern that did not immediately yield confirmation was repeated with greater emphasis, saturating areas already rendered acoustically ambiguous by previous detonations. The deeper escape maneuver exploited this tendency without requiring insight into individual decision-making. It depended solely on predictability. Every explosion reshaped the water column in a way that favored skepticism over clarity. Sound paths bent. Echoes lost coherence. What appeared to be concealment was in fact attenuation driven by pressure gradients and particulate disturbance. The more aggressively the surface force acted, the less reliable its perception became. This inversion of advantage was not intuitive to those trained within frameworks that equated pressure with dominance. To descend further and remain motionless was interpreted as submission or desperation, not strategy. Yet the boat's survival demonstrated that endurance could function as an active countermeasure when paired with acceptable structural risk. The hull did not need to outrun pursuit. It only needed to remain intact long enough for the opposing system to misallocate its effort. Analysis conducted quietly afterward emphasized this point without naming it directly. Engineering assessments highlighted tolerance margins exceeded without catastrophic failure. Acoustic evaluations noted diminished returns correlated with excessive disturbance. Tactical reviews observed that prolonged engagements often terminated without resolution when aggressive search phases extended beyond their optimal window. None of these observations were framed as criticism. They were presented as technical phenomena, detached from blame. The destroyers that abandoned the hunt did so individually rather than collectively, each following internal triggers tied to fuel state, mission priority, or perceived diminishing returns. No signal marked the moment of disengagement as a coordinated admission. The formation unraveled gradually, its coherence diluted by the absence of reinforcement. From above, the sea returned to neutrality. Below, the boat remained an anomaly that doctrine could not easily classify. What made the encounter significant was not its uniqueness, but its repeatability. The method required no special equipment beyond what was already present. It relied on discipline, structural confidence, and restraint in an environment that rewarded the opposite traits superficially but punished them cumulatively. The escape succeeded because it reduced interaction rather than complicated it, allowing the aggressor's own processes to degrade effectiveness over time. This stood in contrast to celebrated engagements where success was attributed to decisive action or superior firepower. There was no spectacle here, no moment that could be pointed to as turning the tide. Instead, there was a prolonged alignment of conditions that favored absence over assertion. The enemy's certainty dissolved not through confrontation, but through persistence without response. As similar stories circulated within operational circles, skepticism softened without formal endorsement. Crews became more willing to consider depth not as a boundary, but as a variable. Command decisions reflected increased tolerance for passivity when conditions supported it. These shifts were incremental, appearing as individual judgment rather than collective reform, but their cumulative effect altered expectations on both sides of the engagement. The destroyer's confidence, reinforced by numerical superiority and technological advantage, remained largely intact. Yet each unresolved hunt chipped away at the assumption that dominance guaranteed outcome. The sea continued to intervene unpredictably, favoring those who imposed fewer demands upon it. Over time, this pattern influenced how risk was calculated, even if it was never openly acknowledged as innovation. The mocked escape became a quiet precedent. It proved that a system designed to apply pressure could exhaust itself when confronted with tolerance instead of resistance. Survival emerged not from contesting control, but from refusing to participate in the terms of engagement imposed from above. The consequences of that refusal were subtle but persistent, shaping engagements long after individual memories blurred. Tactical environments began to reflect hesitation where certainty had once dominated. The expectation of immediate reaction from a submerged target no longer held absolute authority. Silence extended beyond calculated norms. Depth was treated less as a limit and more as an operational condition whose risks could be absorbed rather than avoided. These changes did not announce themselves as reform. They appeared as deviations that survived scrutiny because they produced results without incident. On the surface, destroyer crews encountered an increasing frequency of hunts that ended without confirmation. The absence of debris, the lack of oil, the failure to force contact contradicted established measures of success. Yet institutional frameworks interpreted these outcomes as incomplete rather than incorrect. Engagements were logged, explanations assigned, and responsibility diffused across variables the sea conveniently provided. Environmental complexity offered plausible cover for every uncertainty. The deeper issue remained unaddressed because it challenged the premise upon which anti-submarine warfare rested. Control was assumed to be exerted through action. The more intensive the search, the narrower the window of escape was believed to become. What these encounters demonstrated instead was that escalation could degrade perception faster than a constrained movement. Each detonation, intended to eliminate ambiguity, compounded it through disruption of sound and water structure. The ocean became less readable the more force was applied. Within the hull of boats that adopted sustained depth posture, the experience reinforced a different relationship with time. Waiting ceased to feel passive. It became an active calculation, measured by endurance rather than maneuver. Crews learned to interpret silence above not as the absence of threat, but as evidence of procedural exhaustion. The enemy's persistence could be felt thinning through changes in rhythm, spacing, and eventual dispersion. What mattered was not when the hunt began, but whether it could be sustained indefinitely. Engineering considerations gained prominence over tactical improvisation. Hull integrity, pressure tolerances, and material stress were no longer abstract figures confined to design tables. They became operational assets whose exploitation required calm judgment rather than daring. The willingness to trust these margins distinguished survival from exposure. It was an acceptance that survival depended less on avoiding danger than on remaining functional within it. The destroyer's withdrawal from each unresolved pursuit left behind no clear lesson for their commanders. Reports spoke of extended operations yielding inconclusive outcomes. Recommendations focused on increased coordination, broader coverage, and more aggressive application of force. Rarely was reduction proposed. The idea that restraint could outperform intensity remained incompatible with prevailing assumptions. To concede that quieter methods prevailed would have required a reassessment of authority, training, and technological superiority. Over time, however, the pattern exerted pressure of its own. Statistical reviews revealed diminishing returns from prolonged saturation hunts. Fuel expenditure rose. Ship fatigue increased. Crews reported stress without corresponding achievement. The sea offered no narrative of victory to sustain morale. These factors accumulated quietly, creating space for alternative interpretations without openly challenging doctrine. The mocked escape, when examined without embellishment, demonstrated a principle indifferent to enthusiasm or fear. Systems optimized for detection under certain conditions became inefficient when those conditions were deliberately distorted. By descending beyond expected operational comfort and refusing to restore symmetry, the submerged vessel shifted the engagement away from contest and into imbalance. That imbalance favored endurance over assertion. What changed was not the sea, but how it was used. The water column ceased to function solely as exposure and became a buffer that absorbed both sound and intention. Pressure that threatened collapse also imposed distance. Noise intended to reveal instead obscured. The very tools designed to compel motion encouraged stillness. This inversion held regardless of individual skill. It was built into the interaction between mechanism and environment. As war progressed and encounters multiplied, the distinction between victory and survival blurred at operational levels. Escaping without being destroyed carried strategic weight even when no counterattack followed. Each survival preserved capability, delayed enemy confidence, and forced allocation of resources elsewhere. The cumulative effect of many such withdrawals shaped maritime balance without dramatic confrontation. In this context, the refusal to conform to expected reactions became one of the few reliable methods of remaining unpredictable. Innovation did not require constant change. It required consistency in resisting pressure to respond. The depth escape that had once been derided persisted not because it was daring, but because it aligned endurance with uncertainty in a way that opposing systems struggled to counter. As this alignment between endurance and uncertainty became more common below the surface, the sea itself took on a different operational meaning. It was no longer merely a medium to be traversed or dominated, but a volume whose internal properties could be shaped indirectly through behavior. Pressure gradients, thermal layers, and suspended debris ceased to be incidental and instead became consequences that could be induced. The submerged vessel did not need to control these factors. It only needed to remain within them long enough for the opposing force to lose clarity. Surface commanders continued to rely on confidence built from earlier phases of the war, when detection advantages translated more reliably into destruction. That confidence was sustained by early success and by the visible nature of aggressive pursuit. Charges falling, wakes cutting water, sonar pings echoing through steel decks all served as evidence of effort. Effort was equated with effectiveness. When contact was lost, the response was not to question the premise, but to amplify activity, extending hunts beyond thresholds where returns diminished sharply. Below, the crews who endured these extended hunts experienced a different form of confirmation. Each additional pass above, each new disturbance in the water column, reinforced the sense that the enemy was acting within expectation rather than adapting. Detonations that once carried threat now signaled persistence without insight. Noise marked effort expended in the wrong direction. The submerged vessel survived, not by disappearing, but by remaining exactly where the enemy no longer looked with precision. This dynamic shifted the psychological burden of the engagement. The destroyers were compelled to act, lest inaction be mistaken for negligence. The boat was compelled to remain inactive, lest movement restore detectability. One system required output to justify authority. The other required restraint to remain alive. Over time, the strain of this imbalance favored the quieter side, because endurance demanded fewer concessions than perpetual assertion. In internal evaluations, the notion of depth as refuge was never formalized. Instead, it appeared as a pattern of outcomes that resisted explanation through conventional metrics. Vessels that accepted sustained pressure at greater depth returned intact more often than those that attempted repeated evasive maneuvers within expected layers. This observation unsettled assumptions without directly confronting them. It suggested that visibility and vulnerability were not linearly correlated with depth, but mediated by how force altered the environment itself. The mocked escape, therefore, represented less a maneuver than a correction. It stripped the encounter of gestures intended to deceive and replaced them with acceptance of stress that engineering had already accounted for. Rather than attempting to outthink the enemy, it allowed the enemy to exhaust its own certainty. The outcome depended on reliability, not brilliance. On both sides, machines behaved exactly as designed. Only interpretation failed. As similar cases accumulated, surface forces began to encounter a persistent absence. Targets that remained unconfirmed yet inactive, unlocatable yet unengaged. No decisive moment marked their disappearance. They simply ceased to conform to established engagement logic. For commanders conditioned to pursue closure through destruction, this absence registered as discomfort rather than defeat. It eroded confidence quietly, insisting that effectiveness could no longer be inferred from intensity alone. Within submerged fleets, confidence grew of a different kind. It was not confidence in invulnerability, but in the ability to remain within limits long enough for probability to shift. Crews learned to think in terms of tolerance envelopes rather than escape windows. Survival was measured by how long systems could function under continuous stress without deviation. The absence of motion became a form of control, depriving opponents of feedback required to adapt. This form of control was difficult to counter because it did not rely on concealment in the traditional sense. The boat was not hiding behind silence alone, but behind predictability engineered into the opposing system. The destroyers hunted where doctrine told them to hunt. They applied force where precedent suggested effect. When results failed to appear, they repeated the process with greater resolve, accelerating their own inefficiency. In practical terms, the hunt ended not because the boat escaped, but because the search became unsustainable. Resources depleted, crews fatigued, tactical priorities shifted. The environment returned to baseline without yielding confirmation. The sea retained its neutrality, offering no verdict. What remained was an unresolved engagement that neither side could fully claim, yet one that favored survival over certainty. The legacy of these encounters did not manifest as sweeping reform. It appeared instead as a quiet recalibration of expectation. Depth was no longer treated universally as risk. Stillness was no longer automatically equated with vulnerability. Force was recognized as capable of obscuring as much as revealing. These realizations entered practice gradually, carried by officers who had seen hunts dissolve into ambiguity and by crews who had lived through pressure without motion. The mocked escape endured because it aligned behavior with physics rather than doctrine. It required no admission of error, only patience with discomfort. In the confrontation between system and environment, it demonstrated that the most reliable way to survive was not to dominate conditions, but to remain functional while the opposing system depleted itself in pursuit of certainty that no longer existed. Over time, this approach altered not only tactics, but the conceptual framing of underwater conflict. Engagement ceased to be understood purely as a sequence of actions and reactions, and instead emerged as a contest between systems operating under asymmetric demands. The destroyer force required confirmation to justify continuation. The submerged vessel required only persistence. This disparity reshaped the meaning of initiative. Initiative no longer belonged to the side that moved first or struck harder, but to the side that dictated how long an engagement could remain unresolved. The practical effects of this shift were difficult to quantify, but easy to observe. Search patterns became longer and more diffuse. Commanders hesitated before committing to extended saturation hunts without corroborating indicators. Confidence in decisive outcomes eroded incrementally, replaced by contingency planning that assumed survival without detection was increasingly plausible. These adaptations did not arise from a single revelation, but from accumulation of encounters that ended without conclusion, each one slightly weakening the conviction that procedure alone guaranteed dominance. For the crews beneath the surface, the environment acquired a new role as mediator rather than adversary. Pressure was no longer perceived solely as a threat, but as a condition that imposed equal constraint on both hunter and hunted in different ways. While the hull absorbed physical stress, the opposing force absorbed informational degradation. The longer the boat remained within that state, the more asymmetrical the engagement became. Endurance converted environmental hostility into strategic advantage through sheer continuation. This realization exposed a fundamental vulnerability in approaches that equated superiority with escalation. Escalation consumed resources and clarity simultaneously. Each additional charge displaced water already disrupted. Each subsequent pass compounded acoustic distortion. The sea did not reset between efforts. It retained memory in the form of turbulence, thermal mixing, and particulate suspension, ensuring that persistence by the surface force undermined its own perceptual tools. In contrast, the submerged vessel benefited from this degradation simply by remaining intact. Such interactions challenged long-held beliefs about control. Control was no longer exerted through dominance of space, but through influence over conditions. By refusing to move, the boat denied the enemy data while simultaneously allowing conditions unfavorable to precision to accumulate. The opposing force retained physical presence, but lost informational leverage. This imbalance persisted regardless of numerical advantage, exposing a disconnect between material superiority and operational effectiveness. In assessments conducted without attribution, this pattern was described in technical terms rather than strategic ones. Analysts noted correlations between extended depth exposure and successful evasion. They observed diminishing detection accuracy following prolonged explosive activity. These observations circulated as engineering concerns, acoustical limitations, or environmental anomalies. Rarely were they framed as reversible failures of doctrine. The system protected itself by treating symptoms rather than causes. Despite this, the cumulative effect could not be ignored indefinitely. Training environments began to incorporate scenarios where resolution was delayed rather than enforced. Commanders were evaluated on judgment exercised under uncertainty, not solely on aggressiveness. These changes were subtle and uneven, but they reflected a growing awareness that unresolved contact carried operational meaning even absent destruction. Survival itself influenced strategic balance. The mocked escape maneuver thus persisted as an unspoken reference point. It illustrated how adherence to expectation created vulnerability. By descending beyond comfortable assumptions and remaining there, the submerged vessel exploited predictability that training had rendered rigid. The success of this approach depended less on exceptional leadership than on collective restraint under stress. Discipline replaced audacity as the decisive factor. As more vessels adopted this posture, the psychological landscape of underwater conflict shifted. Anxiety migrated upward. The destroyer crews bore increasing pressure to produce results in environments that resisted clarity. Silence below ceased to reassure and instead signaled a problem unresolved. Effort without outcome fed uncertainty that operational language struggled to contain. The absence of confirmation became its own form of pressure, challenging the assumption that detection and destruction were inseparable. In this way, encounters that ended without visible consequence exerted influence disproportionate to their visibility. They reshaped expectations quietly, forcing systems to confront limitations without admitting error. The sea continued to close over steel without witness, but the logic governing pursuit changed incrementally. Each unresolved hunt reinforced the principle that endurance could neutralize intensity when supported by engineering tolerance and environmental complexity. What remained unresolved was not the fate of any single boat, but the tension between systems designed to act and environments that rewarded restraint. The depth escape, once dismissed as unnecessary risk, endured because it turned that tension into leverage. It required nothing extraordinary, only the patience to remain where pressure mounted and the confidence that certainty above would dissolve before structure below failed. The broader implication of this leverage extended beyond individual engagements and into the architecture of maritime power itself. Naval conflict had long privileged visibility, confirmation, and closure as indicators of success. The depth endurance posture undermined each of these without challenging them directly. It did not contest superiority in firepower or coordination. It simply reframed the encounter so that dominance could not be conclusively demonstrated. In doing so, it shifted emphasis from destruction to denial, from victory to survival, and from assertion to persistence. As unresolved hunts accumulated, operational tempo began to absorb their cost. Destroyer groups tasked with prolonged searches returned having expended fuel and material without tangible outcome. Maintenance cycles shortened. Crew fatigue increased. Command expectations adjusted reluctantly, acknowledging that some targets could neither be confirmed, destroyed, nor reliably forced to surface. This acknowledgement did not translate into concession, but into diffusion. Resources were reassigned across wider areas. Responsibility dispersed. The clarity that once accompanied decisive engagement was replaced by management of uncertainty. The submerged vessels that relied on depth endurance experienced a corresponding simplification of decision-making. They did not need to predict every response or calculate every countermeasure. Their primary requirement was to remain within structural tolerance while minimizing interaction. This approach reduced cognitive load under stress, allowing crews to focus on system integrity rather than tactical improvisation. The absence of motion became a stabilizing factor, anchoring attention inward instead of drawing it outward toward unpredictable threat vectors. The interaction between these two modes revealed a contradiction embedded in layered defense doctrine. Measures designed to compel movement produced conditions that discouraged it. Pressure intended to provoke response instead rewarded immobility. The more complete and methodical the application of force, the more it eroded the informational foundation upon which subsequent decisions depended. This contradiction could not be resolved by refinement alone, because it emerged from the interaction between technology and environment rather than from technical shortcomings. In this context, the notion of escape underwent revision. Escape was no longer defined by distance gained or boundaries crossed, but by disengagement achieved through unresolved contact. The boat did not escape by leaving the area. It escaped by remaining until the enemy left. This inversion altered the temporal structure of conflict. Time favored the side that could wait longer without degradation of capability. The engagement became asymmetrical not in weapons, but in endurance thresholds. Surface forces responded by emphasizing integration, combining detection methods in an attempt to compensate for acoustic uncertainty. Yet the fundamental imbalance persisted. Each additional sensor required interpretation. Each interpretation relied on assumptions that turbulence and depth distortion undermined. The more complex the system became, the greater the penalty when clarity declined. By contrast, the submerged vessel benefited from simplicity, relying on fewer variables whose behavior under stress was already understood. This disparity exposed the limits of escalation as a universal solution. Escalation presumed that increased application of force would converge toward resolution. What depth endurance demonstrated was divergence. The farther escalation proceeded, the more the encounter moved away from deterministic outcome. This realization remained uncomfortable because it implied that the system's strength could degrade its own effectiveness when applied beyond certain thresholds. Within training narratives, this tension appeared as caution rather than transformation. Crews were advised to consider prolonged uncertainty as a realistic outcome. Command evaluations acknowledged that absence of confirmation did not equal absence of effectiveness, but did not define effectiveness anew. The doctrinal framework stretched to accommodate contradiction without reconfiguration, incorporating delay as possibility rather than embracing it as principle. For those beneath the surface, the lesson required no articulation. The experience of remaining intact under sustained pressure created a durable confidence grounded in material reality rather than optimism. Each successful endurance affirmed that engineering margins were not theoretical abstractions, but operational tools. Survival validated design assumptions more persuasively than any test environment could. Over successive encounters, the mocked escape ceased to appear exceptional. It integrated quietly into the repertoire of viable responses, not because it promised superiority, but because it minimized risk by aligning with environmental behavior. Depth became neither sanctuary nor trap, but a condition to be managed patiently. The sea, in this configuration, served as neither ally nor enemy, but as a medium whose properties could be allowed to work without interference. This approach did not promise inevitability. Structural failure remained possible. Human error remained unforgiving. Yet the comparison between active evasion and sustained endurance increasingly favored the latter in scenarios where detection advantages had matured beyond optimization. The choice was no longer between courage and caution, but between visible action and invisible persistence. In unresolved engagements, this persistence exerted influence that no signal could capture. It altered planning assumptions, redistributed effort, and introduced hesitation into processes once characterized by certainty. The destroyers that abandoned their hunts carried forward not defeat, but a residue of doubt that complicated future decisions. That residue accumulated slowly, reshaping the strategic environment without announcement. The depth endurance posture thus functioned as a counterweight to doctrinal inertia. It did not require acceptance by authority. It required only repetition. Each time a boat remained intact where it was expected to fail, the expectation weakened. Over time, the logic of pursuit adjusted not through correction, but through fatigue. Systems that depended on resolution confronted a growing number of encounters that offered none. In that space, endurance became not merely a tactic, but a quiet form of dominance. That dominance expressed itself not through territory claimed or casualties inflicted, but through constraint imposed on the opponent's freedom to conclude. In naval warfare, the ability to declare an outcome mattered as much as the outcome itself. Confirmation validated doctrine, justified expenditure, and reinforced institutional confidence. The depth endurance posture eroded that validation mechanism. It left engagements open-ended, denying the surface forced the closure upon which its authority depended. As this pattern embedded itself deeper into operational reality, strategic planners faced an uncomfortable distinction between control and influence. Control implied certainty and finality. Influence operated through shaping conditions and limiting options without delivering decisive proof. The submerged vessel exercising endurance exerted influence disproportionate to its apparent passivity. By refusing to resolve the engagement, it forced the opposing system to account for uncertainty in every subsequent allocation of effort. This dynamic revealed itself in how missions were framed. Objectives shifted subtly from destruction toward deterrence and denial. Patrol zones expanded. Timelines softened. The expectation that every contact would end decisively gave way to acceptance that some would simply persist unresolved. This adjustment did not signal adaptation so much as accommodation, acknowledging that pressure alone could no longer guarantee outcome in an environment that absorbed force unevenly. For crews beneath the surface, prolonged endurance demanded a different internal rhythm. Training emphasized regulation over reaction. Emotional response was tempered by procedure that normalized strain rather than dramatized it. Each creak of metal, each fluctuation in pressure, reinforced awareness of limits without crossing them. The crew's discipline lay not in bold action, but in resisting impulses born from discomfort. In that restraint, calm became functional rather than aspirational. The destroyer crews experienced the opposite burden. Each unresolved hunt invited scrutiny without delivering confirmation. Effort expended without visible result required explanation. The possibility that the target remained viable introduced lingering operational risk that extended beyond the immediate engagement. Silence below ceased to be neutral. It suggested persistence, competence, and an ability to withstand pressure that doctrine had not anticipated. These psychological asymmetries accumulated quietly. Confidence below grew through direct experience of survival. Confidence above eroded through prolonged absence of evidence. Neither trend dominated headlines or reports, but both influenced judgment. Over time, the willingness to commit resources to extended hunts diminished relative to competing priorities. The sea became an arena where absolute certainty was increasingly expensive to pursue. The endurance posture also exposed the limitations of feedback-driven operations. Surface forces relied on sensors and signals whose reliability declined under saturation. Below, crews relied on the absence of feedback as confirmation that conditions remained favorable. Where one side required constant information flow, the other benefited from its disruption. This imbalance favored simplicity over complexity, patience over intensity. In theoretical terms, the encounter represented a divergence between linear and nonlinear effects. Linear thinking assumed that increased input produced proportionate output. The hunt demonstrated the opposite. Beyond a threshold, additional force yielded diminishing clarity. Nonlinear effects dominated, with environment and system interaction amplifying uncertainty. The submerged vessel exploited this regime not through calculation at the moment, but through consistency across encounters. This consistency gradually reshaped notions of risk. Risk ceased to be defined solely by exposure to immediate destruction and began to include exposure to prolonged uncertainty. For surface commanders, prolonged operations without resolution carried strategic risk that extended beyond individual missions. For submerged crews, prolonged stillness under pressure represented calculable physical risk that could be managed internally. The asymmetry in risk perception further reinforced endurance as a rational choice. No single directive codified this transformation. It emerged as an operational habit formed through repetition and reinforced through survival. Boats that endured returned with intact crews and systems. Those that attempted dramatic escape under saturation faced higher probability of detection or structural compromise. The comparison did not require statistical validation. It was carried forward through lived experience and quiet consensus. In this environment, innovation did not announce itself as change. It presented as stubborn adherence to a course once derided as unnecessary. What had been mocked as excessive caution revealed itself as economy of action. By doing less, the submerged vessel achieved more within the constraints imposed upon it. Endurance optimized outcome not by avoiding danger, but by integrating with it. The destroyers that relinquished pursuit did not interpret endurance as dominance. They interpreted it as absence. Yet that absence achieved its effect regardless of interpretation. It preserved enemy capability. It consumed allied resources. It introduced doubt into planning cycles. Over time, these effects accumulated into strategic weight far exceeding the apparent simplicity of the maneuver that enabled them. Thus, the depth endurance escape persisted not as a celebrated tactic, but as an unremarkable response that worked. It demanded no heroism, only trust in design, patience under pressure, and acceptance of unresolved outcomes as success. In a war defined by measurement and confirmation, it thrived by denying both. Its persistence highlighted a quiet truth that many operational systems avoided articulating. Not all advantages are loud, and not all victories announce themselves. In an environment saturated with sensors, explosives, and procedural certainty, the most effective response was sometimes to introduce nothing new at all. The depth endurance posture did not counter technology with ingenuity or bravado. It countered it with refusal to satisfy its requirements. By remaining present, yet non-participatory, the submerged vessel denied the surface force the data and confirmation it needed to function efficiently. This denial altered how time was perceived across the engagement. For the destroyers, time represented expenditure, risk accumulation, and diminishing return. Each additional cycle increased cost without improving clarity. For the boat below, time represented stabilization. Systems settled into equilibrium. Stress signals plateaued. Familiarity replaced novelty. What initially imposed strain became a known condition that could be monitored rather than feared. The longer the state persisted, the more asymmetric its value became. Such asymmetry undermined the assumption that pressure inevitably forced resolution. It revealed that pressure without feedback could spiral into self-defeat. Detonations intended to reduce uncertainty instead expanded it, introducing noise that overwhelmed interpretation. Movement intended to constrain space merely rearranged turbulence. The operational theater flooded with activity produced diminishing informational yield. Meanwhile, inactivity below preserved a clearer internal picture, however limited, within the hull's confines. The endurance posture also reshaped command dynamics inside the boat. Authority shifted subtly from maneuver specialists to system specialists. Attention prioritized integrity over initiative. Decision-making focused on thresholds rather than opportunities. This internal reweighting mattered because it conserved cognitive resources under stress. When crews were not tasked with constant adjustment, they could maintain coherence longer. Endurance became not only a physical attribute, but an organizational one. Above the surface, organizational strain manifested differently. Coordination required constant reaffirmation in the absence of results. Commands circulated that reference probability rather than certainty. The need to justify continuation competed with external demands elsewhere. The hunt did not fail decisively. It simply lost urgency. And urgency, once diminished, was rarely restored for the same contact. This gradual dissipation mattered strategically. Engagements that ended without resolution preserved the submerged force while degrading the persistence of the surface force. The asymmetry favored the side that could accept ambiguity as outcome. Over time, this altered how planners value engagements whose success could not be verified. The expectation of closure weakened. Survival gained operational relevance equal to destruction. The endurance posture also demonstrated how predictability could be redirected. It did not make the submerged vessel unpredictable in motion. It made the opposing system predictable in response. By conforming to assumptions about fear, damage, and desperation, the depth escape allowed surface forces to follow scripts that no longer tracked reality. Predictability migrated upward, leaving the hunter more exposed than the hunted. This inversion complicated attempts at adaptation. Surface forces could refine patterns, expand coverage, or integrate additional sensors, but each refinement increased complexity that suffered under degraded conditions. The underlying vulnerability remained, the requirement for actionable signals. Without them, even the most elaborate systems hesitated. The sea continued to privilege those who demanded less from it. Importantly, this did not render surface dominance irrelevant. The danger remained real. Structural failure, cumulative shock, and human error preserved the lethality of pursuit. Endurance was not immunity. It was probability management. It reduced exposure to certain failure modes while accepting calculable risk. That balance proved favorable often enough to influence behavior without guaranteeing outcome. As war progressed, these lessons blended into operational culture almost invisibly. Stories circulated without attribution. Recommendations were phrased cautiously. Training materials hinted at tolerance without celebrating it. Commanders who had lived through unresolved hunts carried an altered sense of expectation into future decisions. None of this required doctrinal proclamation. It required only the persistence of unresolved encounters. In this way, the mocked escape reshaped engagement logic precisely because it did not seek recognition. It remained unattractive to narratives that favored decisive action. Yet its effectiveness lay in that very unattractiveness. It bypassed the need for acknowledgement by simply denying consequence. The surface force moved on. The boat endured. The engagement passed into records as incomplete, but its influence remained. The sea, indifferent to classification or interpretation, continued to absorb both noise and doubt. Within its depth, systems interacted according to pressures and tolerances rather than intent or doctrine. Those who aligned themselves with that reality endured longer than those who attempted to impose order upon it. The depth endurance posture did not promise superiority. It promised survival under conditions where certainty favored no one. Through repetition, survival accumulated into strategic effect. Each unresolved hunt preserved potential future action. Each preserved hull extended the conflict by maintaining capacity. The absence of dramatic outcome did not diminish impact. It redistributed it over time, weighing subtly on resource allocation, morale, and expectation. In that redistribution, the endurance posture exerted a form of control that remained difficult to counter because it refused to define itself as victory. The destroyers that abandoned their search did so, believing the moment had passed. In reality, the moment lingered, its influence diffusing outward through procedures, planning, and perception. The deep escape that had once been dismissed as needless risk became an ordinary possibility, not because it was codified, but because it worked often enough to be remembered silently. That silent remembrance carried forward into a broader recalibration of naval thought, though rarely expressed in explicit terms. What endured was not a rewritten doctrine, but a softening of certainty. Certainty had once been treated as a product of sufficient action. Now it became apparent that certainty also required a cooperative environment, and the deep sea was rarely cooperative for sustained precision. In its refusal to clarify, it favored those who could tolerate ambiguity longer than their opponents. This tolerance altered how commanders judged success and failure. An engagement that preserved a submerged vessel without producing evidence of destruction could no longer be dismissed as incidental. It forced planners to account for possibilities that resisted closure. Patrol routes were reconsidered. Resource commitments balanced more cautiously against unresolved risk. The assumption that aggressive pursuit would necessarily eliminate threat weakened, replaced by an acceptance that denial without destruction still shaped the battle space. For crews below, the experience reinforced an ethic that valued composure over reaction. The capacity to remain in place, while subjected to repeated disturbance, demanded discipline that went beyond training. It required trust in systems whose limits were known abstractly, but felt viscerally only under pressure. Each successful endurance recalibrated that trust, transforming theoretical tolerance into operational confidence. The hull no longer represented merely protection. It became a measurable buffer whose behavior under load could be anticipated. This anticipation reduced fear not by minimizing danger, but by contextualizing it. Stress ceased to be an unpredictable adversary and became a parameter to be observed. Small changes were tracked, sounds categorized, vibrations interpreted. The environment inside the vessel stabilized into a closed world whose rules were understood. Outside, by contrast, the environment became increasingly chaotic for those attempting to control it through force. The louder the pursuit grew, the less intelligible it became. This divergence shaped the psychological balance of the hunt. The surface force, despite numerical and material advantage, found itself compelled to escalate activity to justify continuity. The submerged vessel found survival reinforced by restraint. The imbalance did not immediately invert authority, but it redistributed strain. Over time, strain accumulated where action was mandatory rather than optional. From a perspective of strategic endurance, this redistribution mattered. War at sea was not decided solely by individual victories, but by the ability to maintain operational tempo across many engagements. Each unresolved hunt absorbed attention, fuel, and readiness while preserving adversary potential. The endurance posture exploited that reality without engaging it directly. It allowed the enemy's energy to dissipate while retaining capacity for future encounters. The mocked escape thus revealed a paradox at the heart of mechanized pursuit. Systems designed to eliminate uncertainty depended upon assumptions that uncertainty could be controlled. When those assumptions failed, the system continued to act as though they held, compounding inefficiency. The submerged vessel did not defeat that system. It waited until the system defeated itself through unproductive persistence. In internal reflections that circulated among experienced officers, this pattern was noted quietly. Words such as patience, tolerance, and endurance appeared more frequently, though rarely in formal directives. These qualities were framed as personal attributes rather than strategic tools. Yet their consistent association with survival lent them weight that could not be dismissed. Commanders who had witnessed unresolved hunts adjusted their expectations subtly, allowing for outcomes that previous generations might have rejected as unacceptable. The endurance posture also influenced how loss was perceived. The absence of confirmation complicated claims of success and softened the apparent finality of defeat. Engagements blurred at the edges, leaving room for doubt about outcomes on both sides. This ambiguity favored the side that required less validation. For submerged forces, continued existence sufficed. For surface forces, absence of proof demanded further action. Over time, this imbalance reshaped planning horizons. Effort was spread across wider areas to compensate for reduced certainty in any single engagement. Concentration of force gave way to distribution. The very mechanism intended to guarantee control diluted its own effectiveness by acknowledging uncertainty implicitly. In this way, endurance below exerted pressure upward through structural consequences rather than tactical surprise. The depth escape that had once been ridiculed did not become celebrated. It remained understated, even uncomfortable, because it challenged the narrative that dominance was expressed through visible action. Yet it persisted because it aligned with how machines, materials, and environments actually behaved when stressed beyond ideal conditions. It accepted friction rather than denying it. That acceptance translated into survivability. As encounters accumulated, the sea retained no record, but institutions did, even if imperfectly. Logbooks filled with phrases that suggested absence without explanation. Evaluations referenced conditions rather than outcomes. Decisions reflected a cautious awareness that some contacts would not resolve cleanly. In that awareness, the endurance posture achieved influence without recognition. The destroyers that disengaged from their hunts carried away more than fuel expenditure and fatigue. They carried a subtle adjustment in expectation, a recognition that pressure did not always compel compliance. This recognition did not dismantle doctrine, but it complicated it, introducing hesitancy where certainty had once prevailed. The submerged vessel did not need to exploit that hesitancy actively. It benefited from it simply by remaining. In the end, the significance of the depth endurance escape lay in its ordinariness. It asked nothing extraordinary of men or machines, only the willingness to accept sustained discomfort. That willingness proved more disruptive to established systems than any dramatic maneuver. By persisting quietly under pressure, it redefined the terms of engagement without ever announcing that it had done so. What emerged from these encounters, when viewed at the scale of the whole conflict rather than the moment of danger, was not a trick or an exception, but a correction to how industrial war behaved beneath the surface. The depth endurance escape did not overturn naval doctrine in a single stroke. It did something quieter and ultimately more consequential. It revealed that mature systems do not always fail by being overmatched. They fail by being overconfident in the environments they assume they control. Submarine warfare had entered a phase where technology, procedure, and mass production promised predictability. Detection ranges improved. Explosive patterns became standardized. Coordination between ships tightened. These advances created the belief that pressure, if applied correctly and long enough, would always force resolution. What the deep endurance posture exposed was that this belief depended on environmental cooperation that could not be guaranteed. The ocean was not a neutral stage. It participated, absorbed, distorted, and remembered. At strategic scale, survival without detection mattered as much as destruction. Each boat that endured preserved trained crews, industrial investment, and future operational potential. Each unresolved hunt forced surface forces to account for threats that could not be eliminated on schedule. This shaped convoy planning, escort distribution, and campaign pacing. Even when no tonnage was sunk and no shots were fired, capacity remained alive beneath the sea, exerting pressure simply by existing. The Long War was not decided only by decisive clashes or celebrated innovations. It was shaped by cumulative friction, by the limits of systems operating at scale, and by the quiet persistence of methods that worked without spectacle. Depth endurance fit this pattern precisely. It favored restraint over assertion, tolerance over maneuver, and probability management over dramatic risk. Its success lay in compatibility with physics rather than psychology. Over time, this compatibility altered how navies thought about underwater combat. Absolute control gave way to probabilistic dominance. The expectation that every contact could be resolved decisively faded. Doctrine adjusted indirectly, accepting ambiguity as a condition rather than a failure. The sea remained hostile, but it was no longer treated as uniformly hostile in the same direction. Pressure could protect as well as threaten. Silence could conceal by endurance rather than motion. The four destroyers that abandoned their hunt were responding rationally within their framework. They withdrew not in panic or error, but because the system they belonged to reached a point of diminishing return. Fuel, fatigue, and priority outweighed certainty. At the level of campaign logic, that withdrawal mattered. It preserved the submerged vessel and redistributed surface resources elsewhere, altering future engagements invisibly. When examined after the war, these episodes did not stand out as turning points. They left no wrecks, no survivors for interrogation, no dramatic signals intelligence. Yet their cumulative effect shaped the balance of effort beneath the sea. They demonstrated that endurance could neutralize superiority when superiority depended on forcing reaction. They showed that a system designed to compel movement could be frustrated by refusal to move, so long as that refusal remained within material limits. History often records innovation as deliberate change. In reality, much of it arrives as tolerated deviation. The depth endurance escape survived skepticism because it did not openly challenge authority. It simply delivered crews home intact. Over time, repetition gave it legitimacy. Quiet success accumulated into institutional awareness without ever demanding recognition. In the industrial war beneath the oceans, this lesson endured. Not every advantage announces itself. Not every victory is affirmative. Some are defined entirely by the absence of outcome, by pressure that fails to break, and by systems that exhaust themselves against patience. In those depths beneath detonations and doctrine alike, endurance proved to be not merely survival, but a strategic force in its own right.